I'll show you some results from research joined with Giorgio Chiavelli of London Business School and Stelios Michalopoulos of Brown that touch a much unexplored issue, that of landmines and improvised explosive devices that affects the lives of people in a surprisingly large number of countries. Iraq, Cambodia, Bosnia in the Balkans, Ukraine, Zimbabwe, many other African countries, not to say Yemen and Syria, where if you follow the news, landmines are currently employed by various militias, government forces, and other, if I would say, private players. So one of the nice things working at the LBS is that somehow you learn about the issue of landmines, and actually thanks to the generosity of DFID, we managed to secure with Giorgio and Stelios some funding to explore this issue that has not received much attention from my colleagues who specialize in development economics. And after 3 years and a lot of data collection, we were very pleased in June 2008 to release our paper, and we have set also a website with a lot of material, reports, photographs, videos, focusing on Mozambique, a country that we believe can offer some insights about the way that the international community and governments have to proceed in the years to come, because when hopefully conflict will be over in Syria or in Yemen or in Myanmar, one of the tasks of reconstruction will entail clearing of those vast territories from landmines, unexploded ordnances, and improvised explosive devices. And one of the great things that happened to us, if I was to say on a personal note, was that during the past 3 years, we have engaged with immensely motivated and inspiring people working on landmine clearance, Jean-Baptiste Richardier being one, Martin Barber being another one, many individuals who go in those places and they try to do landmine clearance as we speak in Syria, which is, it's way easier for me to say it from downtown London as compared to doing it on the ground. Now, our study focuses on Mozambique, a lovely country and very beautiful, which offers some interesting insights on this topic because it is the only so far country that has moved from a status of heavily impacted by landmines. This was how the UN officials classified Mozambique at the end of the War of Independence and the subsequent civil war in 1992, when the country was one of the 3 poorest countries in the world. And up as of October 2015, the country was officially declared landmine-free. A small caveat here: when a country is declared landmine-free, doesn't necessarily mean that there are no landmines or improvised explosive devices. It just means that there are no areas that with confidence we know that there are landmines. So, working with various non-governmental organizations, officials from the government of Mozambique, we managed to assess, collect, and process data from landmine clearance operations that cover, roughly speaking, 8,000 minefields, and with a conservative estimate of 300,000 mines, plotted all across Mozambique. And having assembled this data, we asked 3 questions that we believe carry lessons for development practice in the years to come. First, what are the local, or if you like, economic effects of landmine contamination and, of course, of clearance? For example, if you clear an area from landmines, does economic activity pick up? Does it pick up a lot? Or are there some places where economic activity picks up way a lot, while perhaps in some other places the effects of clearance are perhaps muted? Second, and this is what I think it's an interesting tool coming from economics, is that as practitioners, and especially if you go high up on politicians and key policymakers, they don't necessarily want to know what is the effect of landmine clearance on the village level or the town level, but for example, the international community wants to know the millions of dollars that they spend assisting Mozambique in being cleared, does it have an aggregate effect? And there are some interesting techniques developed by researchers working in international trade and spatial economics that perhaps can be employed to assess a question like that. And thirdly, we try to perform some counterfactual policy simulations that will try us to shed some light on which areas should we prioritize. We of course look in Mozambique, but perhaps the findings from Mozambique carry lessons for other countries. So this is the data that we used. So effectively, our analysis just exploits variation on the removal of landmines that you see on the left and economic activity as reflected on satellite images on light density at night that we can get from satellites. And we have to rely on data on luminosity because, especially in the 90s, Mozambique was one of the poorest parts of the world, and we lack any reliable information on, a core or a more direct development proxy. So let me just go and guide you over our results. Our first result suggests that when a particular area, when a locality, so think about size-wise a US county, when you clear a locality from any contamination by landmines or unexploded ordnance, luminosity, so this coarse measure of economic activity, tends to pick up a bit. So there seems to be some evidence that when you clear a particular area, economic activity picks up. And what is further interesting is that when you do partial clearance, actually economic activity doesn't pick that much, suggesting that, if humanity and inclusion wants to go now and clear an area in Colombia, perhaps they have to finish the job in this area. Now, the second result is that we really wanted to go deeper into which areas tend to benefit the most from landmine clearance. And what the evidence points to, and actually this was a bit surprising to the non-governmental agencies and the practitioners that we were chatting with, it seems that the effect seems to be particularly large in areas that were connected to the very limited, to be sincere, road and railroad infrastructure that the Portuguese left in the country. And when clearance happened in areas that were isolated close to the borders with Tanzania or Zimbabwe, these are like extremely rural and very low development places, actually we couldn't find any positive effect of landmine clearance. So this pushed us towards understanding more what is happening. So we applied an idea that comes from the quantitative trade literature that is centered around this market access. So let me quickly elaborate what's that. So you can think about two areas, one that is very well connected to all other areas, and perhaps another village where it's not particularly connected to the rest of the place. So let me just show you a concrete example. So this is what you see on the left and the right, is if you were to go to Google Maps today in Mozambique, actually we tried it with Georgia a couple of years when we were there, and you want to go from the capital of Maputo to the town of Funchaluro, which is a bit north of Maputo. If you were to do it today, actually you would go over the so-called N1 highway that goes in parallel with the Indian Ocean, and then after some time you will go westwards. So this will take you, roughly speaking, something like 8 hours today. Had you done this back in 1992, when of course Google Maps was not available, all those areas with black here denote minefields. It could be a large minefield with perhaps dozens of mines. It could be just a single mine or a couple of mines. So at that time, actually, you couldn't travel across the N1 because the road was heavily mined. So you had to follow some trails and footpaths and secondary roads. And according to our estimates, it will take you something to 35, perhaps 40 hours. So effectively, our econometric approach, that I don't want to go into much detail, exploits this type of variation. Like when you remove landmines here, it's not only this area that perhaps benefits, but actually all those northern areas will be able to get connected to Maputo, which is the core of economic activity in Mozambique. So what do we find? So there, what you see on the left is that we find that there is some local average effect, positive, like the one I detailed earlier, but actually this aggregate, this spillover effect, if you like, tends to be quite as large as the local one. In other words, if you remove landmines from a particular area, it is not only that area that benefits, but nearby areas, or perhaps further away areas that are connected through a road or a railroad, will also benefit. And the best way to show that is that you can look at, roughly speaking, 350 Mozambican localities that were not contaminated by landmines at all. And this is what you see here. So what you see here is that the market access of those localities also increased because now you are clearing mines and you are removing improvised explosive devices and uxus from nearby places. So still you have a spillover effect which is positive and highly significant both statistically and economically due to those spillovers. And we believe that this was an interesting insight that perhaps it wasn't the thought of practitioners, but not so much of governmental agencies, not to say of other international institutions. Now the third result, which we believe carries some lessons for the clearance of other heavily impacted by landmines countries in the world today. Now, the case and the example of Mozambique, it is a successful example of taking a country that was heavily mined in fully clearing it. But especially during the 90s and the early 2000s, landmine clearance took place under chaotic situation. The country in 1992, actually a Human Rights Watch report called that parts of Mozambique had returned to a Stone Age condition, and actually insecurity and fragility was actually quite high in the 90s. So in the 90s, a lot of those interventions were ad hoc, not particularly well thought. For example, Handicap International was clearing in a particular area, Halo Trust was clearing in another particular area without much talking to each other and without much thinking of exactly what kind of interventions they were doing. So what you see here is the change in actual market access, so this way to think about spillovers, and the simulated one. And here we do actually a very simple simulation. We say, look, how about if you don't know much about Mozambique? And actually the three of us didn't know much about Mozambique when we entered this project. Well, perhaps it makes sense to clear the only highway that the country had, which connects Maputo to the center, actually, not even the north. And then perhaps you clear the three main railroads, or the so-called three development corridors that connect the three port cities to Zimbabwe and to Johannesburg. So what we find here, let me just guide you over two results. So let me just show you perhaps the clearest example. So there are four sets of municipalities. So those municipalities were not affected by landmines, so they were not contaminated at all. And our simulation suggests that they should not have been prioritized. Market access increased to some extent because you are clearing all the other areas. But if you were to target those central areas that we tell the computer to simulate for us, actually market access increase would have been something like 30 to 40% higher. Let me show you another good example. This is a set of localities that in reality they were cleared, they were prioritized, they were cleared in the early period, and actually our simulation suggests that they should also have been prioritized. So these are like areas stranding most likely N1. Well, the evidence suggests that, look, market access increased, but had you prioritized other areas that are central in an infrastructure network setting, market access would have increased even more. So the lessons that come from those counterfactual policy simulations are the following. First of all, when you do clearance, as the international community is trying nowadays to clear a sizable portion of Colombia, or parts of Cambodia, or many other parts of the world, perhaps you want to also think a bit about economics. In reality, how you do landmine clearance is extremely complicated. It entails getting around perhaps inefficient governmental structures. You have to work with various international agencies, and this is far from easy. But perhaps you need to think also about the economics. Now, if you think about the economics, there is, I think, a lot of evidence suggesting that most of development comes in, roughly speaking, urban places where a lot of trade and exchange of ideas take place. So perhaps you want to prioritize those areas. Because landmine clearance entails positive externalities. When you clear an area, other areas tend also to benefit. Now, how can you do that? Well, the approach that the international community had followed for decades has been, something like a free market, if you like, approach. A particular non-governmental agency or commercial player will be clearing area A, another agency will clear area B. Those people wouldn't talk that much to each other. They would be competing for fundraising. There was not much coordination, not to say prioritization. Our approach is that coordination and centralization is needed, and for the economists of the room, perhaps this is not great news, because if you have externalities, we know that if everybody does his or her own thing, things are not necessarily optimal. Now there is also a final lesson. Clearly we need more research and more case studies, but I think a lesson, if I was to be an advocate, is that the international community, actually thanks to the great work of Jean-Baptiste among others, passed this international resolution to ban anti-personnel landmines, and this was back in the late 90s. And most countries, not all countries, have complied with that. But actually, anti-tank or anti-vehicle landmines are still legal. This was my understanding. The ministers of defense were arguing for a strategic reason that the banning should exclude anti-tank and anti-vehicle landmines. But our research, and it is not only our research, but also research in infrastructure, and also on the effect of spatial and agglomeration economics, suggests that anti-tank and anti-vehicle landmines are especially detrimental to economic activity because they block roads and railroads, and by doing that, they prevent the exchange of goods and also of ideas. Thank you very, very much.